Provided by the new economy. After growing up in the Brooklyn projects and serving some time where the
we make all of our decisions. I like.
A worker cooperative is a firm that is owned and managed by customers. Many nations which are work
the building. Something happens, you don't feel it, see it, or smell it, but it happens.
Economic system.
Visit neweconomy.net.
You are listening
to Upstream.
Upstream. Upstream.
Upstream.
A radio documentary series that invites you to unlearn everything you thought you knew about economics. I'm Della Duncan.
And I'm Robert Raymond.
Join us as we journey upstream
to the heart of our economic system and discover cutting-edge stories
of game-changing solutions
based on connection,
resilience,
and prosperity for all.
I remember it was like Independence Day on a Sunday. It's like 10 o'clock at night. I'm still trying to finish up a project. I'm in San Francisco, and I just took a pause and went to go see the fireworks. And it was something about it being Independence Day, and I'm stuck working. And, you know, at that time I was on salary, so it was like the more you work, the less you really get. In the corporate system, they love that. So they can extract as much energy and labor out of you as possible. And I felt that if I was going to work 24/7, 365 for something, it had to be something that I believed in, that I was passionate about. I knew that I would never be an owner of that business. You know, even as a branch manager or a night supervisor or a regional manager, which was what I was moving to. And that say so over how much I made, how much my labor was worth, that amount of control over my life was not going to be there. That was my eye-opener. After that, I said, you know what, something's got to change, and I started up an organization, Richly Rides Bike Skate Shop, with the intention of creating a worker cooperative.
Worker Cooperative. This is the subject of this two-part series, and the voice you just heard was that of Najari Smith. After growing up in the Brooklyn projects and serving some time as a young adult, Najari decided to come out west after the company he was working for offered to relocate him with a promotion. He married his girlfriend, and they moved to San Francisco. His corporate job paid pretty well and provided them with temporary housing in the city. He was doing well for the first 3 months, but then his housing stipend came to an end, and he quickly discovered he wasn't being paid close enough to cover the cost of living in San Francisco, where the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $3,500 per month. So he moved to Fruitvale, and then to West Oakland, and that's when things began to unravel. In the ensuing months, Najari quit his corporate job, separated from his wife, and eventually found himself living in Richmond, California, where, using his savings from his liquidated 401k retirement account, he founded a cooperative bike and skate shop called Rich City Rides. We asked him how he felt in his new work environment.
I like coming to work. That's a big difference. I like coming to work. Me and the other worker owners talk about how the business is doing, and we celebrate when we have a month that's better than the same month last year. Everything is transparent. We know exactly where all the money is going. We make all of our decisions collectively. It's a total, it's not even a 180 from any corporate jobs or any other jobs that I've ever worked. It's a different world. It's the new economy I want to see.
Okay, hold up. Before we go any further, what exactly is a worker cooperative? Here's Sophia Graydon, who teaches politics at King's College London, with a brief Cooperative 101.
A worker cooperative is a firm that is owned and managed by its own employees. Worker cooperatives can be found all over the world, with varying degrees of influence. They rose to prominence during the Industrial Revolution as part of the labour movement. Since their inception, there have been a set of principles at the heart of worker cooperatives called the Rochdale Principles, enshrining their common values of democracy, transparency, collectivity, and concern for the community into their work as a movement. In worker co-ops, employees are called members, and they vote in all strategic decisions, similar to shareholders in a corporation. But the difference with corporations is that in a worker co-op, one person gets only one vote, just like in a democracy. An interesting and important aspect of most worker co-ops is their pay ratio, the difference in pay between the highest and the lowest paid workers. In most cooperatives, the pay ratio is 1-to-1, meaning that everyone gets paid the exact same amount. Sometimes it's a bit higher than that, but not nearly as much as in traditional companies. For example, in the United States, the average pay ratio for non-cooperative companies is 271-to-1. A worker cooperative is also different from other kinds of cooperatives, like consumer co-ops, for example, which are owned by customers. Many grocery co-ops are actually consumer co-ops, not worker co-ops. Finally, there are also housing co-ops and banking co-ops too, which are known as credit unions. There are also worker self-directed non-profits, which are mission-driven charity organisations, which are worker-managed but not owned. But these are all different from worker co-ops. This has been Sophia Graydon with an Upstream 101 on worker cooperatives.
When you go to work in the morning, when you go to your office, your store, your factory, and you cross the threshold into the building, something happens. You don't feel it, see it, or smell it, but it happens.
This is Richard Wolf. He's been an economics professor all his adult life and currently teaches at the New School in New York City.
Namely, you enter a world in which there are big decisions being made every day on your life. The decision of whether or not you have a job in this building or not. Whether the first thing that happens to you is that someone ushers you right out of the building because you have no right to be there. Or instead, that person says, oh, welcome, you are a worker here. Go sit in that desk with that machine doing this activity in the way that I tell you for a length of time we've agreed to, and then you go home and you leave behind what you have produced. You've used your brains, your muscles to make something happen, but it belongs to somebody else, and you go home and you rest and you come back tomorrow and we do this all again. The decision about whether or not you have a job is absolutely fundamental in your life, can even affect your health or your very survival. Likewise, a decision of whether you sit in a lit place or a dark place, whether there's noise or there isn't, whether the air is any good or it isn't, these are all decisions that affect you.
Okay, we go. Let's do this.
But in the building,
Hold on.
Customers. Many grocery co-ops are actually consumer co-ops, not worker co-ops.
Okay, I already grown this up.
Finally, there are also housing co-ops and banking co-ops too, which are known as credit unions. There are also worker self-directed non-profits, which are mission-driven charity organisations, which are worker-managed but not owned. But these are all different from worker co-ops. This has been Sophia Graydon with an Upstream 101 on worker cooperatives.
Alright, listen to this. Listen to this part. This is the part I was wanting to stream for.
when you go to work in the morning, when you go to your office, your store, your factory, and you cross the threshold into the building, something happens. You don't feel it, see it, or smell it, but it happens.
This is Richard Wolf. He's been an economics professor all his adult life and currently teaches at the New School in New York City.
Namely, you enter a world in which there are big decisions being made every day on your life. The decision of whether or not you have a job in this building or not. Whether the first thing that happens to you is that someone ushers you right out of the building because you have no right to be there. Or instead, that person says, oh, welcome, you are a worker here. Go sit in that desk with that machine doing this activity in the way that I tell you for a length of time we've agreed to, and then you go home and you leave behind what you have produced. You've used your brains, your muscles to make something happen, but it belongs to somebody else, and you go home and you rest and you come back tomorrow and we do this all again. The decision about whether or not you have a job is absolutely fundamental in your life, can even affect your health or your very survival. Likewise, the decision of whether you sit in a lit place or a dark place, whether there's noise or there isn't, whether the air is any good or it isn't, these are all decisions that for a length of time, for a length of building.
Okay, hold on.
There are also
Morning, when you go to your office, your store, your factory, and you cross the threshold into the building, something happens. You don't feel it, see it, or smell it, but it happens.
This is Richard Wolff. He's been an economics professor all his adult life and currently teaches at the New School in New York City.
Namely, you enter a world in which there are big decisions being made every day on your life. The decision of whether or not you have a job in this building or not. Whether the first thing that happens to you is that someone ushers you right out of the building because you have no right to be there. Or instead, that person says, oh, welcome, you are a worker here. Go sit in that desk with that machine doing this activity in the way that I tell you for a length of time we've agreed to, and then you go home and you leave behind what you have produced. You've used your brains, your muscles to make something happen, but it belongs to somebody else, and you go home and you rest and you come back tomorrow and we do this all again. The decision about whether or not you have a job is absolutely fundamental in your life, can even affect your health or your very survival. Likewise, the decision of whether you sit in a lit place or a dark place, whether there's noise or there isn't, whether the air is any good or it isn't, these are all decisions that affect you. But in your workplace, here comes the punchline. You have no power over those decisions. You have no participation. The end result is you are in a place, the workplace in modern capitalism, where there is no democracy. And that has been true from the founding of the United States right through this minute. And it means that when you refer to the United States as a democratic society, you either understand what you're saying and thereby exempt the economic space of society, or you don't know what you're saying because you've never faced what I've just said. And yet the economic space of society is crucial, because for most adults, that's where you spend most of your life. 9 to 5, 5 out of 7 days of every week, you're at work. So if you actually believe in democracy as the way to do things, then you are in a society where you are spending most of your time, most of your living hours in an undemocratic, non-democratic space.
Cooperatives take a direct swipe at capitalist greed.
Here's Najari Smith again.
Somebody at the top of the pyramid having a say over everybody else's livelihood. I remember my uncle, he once said, I told him, how much I was getting paid and, this new job that I got. And he's like, they're paying you what they have to pay you. They're paying you as much as they can to keep you on board. And I didn't really get that right away, One thing that I feel cooperatives do is they give the value of an individual's labor back to that individual.
To learn more about the advantages of co-ops, here's Esteban Kelly, the Executive Director of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, a national grassroots membership organization that advances worker-owned, managed, and governed workplaces through education, advocacy, and development.
People form any kind of co-op, consumer co-ops, producer co-ops, purchasing, marketing co-ops, worker co-ops, to share risk. If you start a family-owned business and it goes under, that's your whole family. Your whole family's assets, savings, whatever, that's wiped out. For worker co-ops, sharing the risk among all of the workers there it's just a less risky way of going about getting into business, and it also means that you can lean into the multiple owners if you need to tighten your belts, when you're faced with challenges. So we know this now through longitudinal economic data that worker co-ops are more stable and successful compared to traditional business models. They're also more efficient, it turns out. Prior to doing the research and having the data, we have this sort of cultural assumption that, well, you're involving more people, this must inherently be less efficient. But it turns out that the glut of management and middle managers and even people who are in hierarchical positions holding power or decision making where they don't necessarily have the full range of expertise over many things tends to be a little bit wasteful.
A democratic system works better.
Here's Professor Richard Wolff again.
The results we'll have, the decisions that are made about what we produce, how we do it, where we do it, what's done with the profits, we will get better decisions if they're democratically arrived at than we get now. When we allow a small minority, not a democracy, but a small minority of people to own enterprises and to direct them, which is what capitalism is, then we really can't be surprised if they make decisions that service them, that serve them first, that put them first. And then all the rest of us who are not major shareholders, who are not members of board of directors, are living in an economy that's serving someone ahead of us, which we kind of all know, but we're afraid to see what that implies, which is, if you want the economy to serve the people, you've got to put the people in charge. It's the first understanding that all democracy comes from. And that's my argument. We would be in better shape economically if we let those decisions be made democratically that are now made by the autocracy of capitalism.
In the problem solving of some of the business challenges that might come up, and they don't get that wanderlust to find or do something new. So yeah, there's kind of a lot of economic data on the benefits of worker ownership. And then there's all the squishier stuff, the sort of social impact of civic engagement, leadership development, increasing financial literacy among women and minority business owners. Even if that business ends up closing after a couple of years, you now have a whole community of people who have really upped their game in getting the kind of leadership development and education that traditionally is only accessible to middle class or even upper middle class and wealthy people.
The last several years have seen an explosion of interest in worker cooperatives, so much so that the United Nations General Assembly designated 2012 as the International Year of Cooperatives. Since the latest collapse of capitalism in 2008, people have been eager for alternative models. The energy, anger, and desire for change that fueled movements like Occupy Wall Street have since been channeled into a number of different directions, including efforts to radically restructure the workplace. According to a 2017 report by the Democracy at Work Institute, over 60% of worker cooperatives in the United States formed after the year 2000, and over 30% after 2010. And the number has the potential to continue to rise as we begin to see what's called by some the silver tsunami, referring to hundreds of thousands of baby boomers who are expected to retire in the next 10 to 15 years. As they sell their businesses, around 300,000 per year, they're going to be participating in perhaps the largest transfer of wealth in U.S. history. Instead of selling off to the highest bidder or submitting to liquidation and closure, there's an opportunity for many of these businesses to be sold to their workers and converted into worker cooperatives.
The idea of worker co-ops is now an idea whose time has come. Marx is famous for when Marx, ideas only become important in the world when they grab, the consciousness of masses of people. Co-op is right in the moment of doing that. It's becoming the idea, and it's partly becoming the idea, and this is perhaps the most important point, because the defenders of capitalism, particularly since the Second World War, have worked so hard to demonize every alternative that what they have done is convinced people that even if you don't like capitalism, it's all there is. It's what must be. It's the final step. So we then are given an unbelievable opportunity, which I use every chance I get. No, there's something you can do. Not only can you do it, it's being done. It's all around you. There's a moment when you reach a person when they have a little mini epiphany, because they somehow thought there was no else. There was no other. There was no solution. And we are saying, here's one. Here's a whole other way of organizing the enterprise that would make you much happier going to work every day than you are now. Make work a much more interesting development of your whole personality than the particular job you have now. Give you opportunities to shape your own life you do not have now. It would change you as a human. Here's the revolution. Here's the new society, not as an abstraction, not as giving the government far away some power. No, right here. Your everyday life is going to transform, and you're going to be the master of your own fate. Let me end with a little story. For many, many years, in my large classes at the University of Massachusetts, I would hand out a piece of paper at the beginning, and I would say to the students, tell me your name and your major, all that. But the real wasn't that. I asked them a question. Tell me what you imagine your preferred economic situation will be 5 years after you graduate. So, what are you hoping to do? Overwhelming majority said, I want to be my own boss. Right? They wanted something, which I explained then in my first lecture in the class. They wanted something that there was no chance they were going to get. That is, the number of them who would end up being their own boss is this percentage. And they knew it. But they wanted it anyway. The co-op is the closest they're going to ever get. And when you get that into their heads, they become advocates of co-ops.
Why does Richmond need a bike and skate shop?
Richmond needs a bike and skate shop because, well, for one, there's no other bike shops in like a 5-mile radius of Rich City Rides. We're the only bike shop in the city. Richmond needs Rich City Rides in particular because we show the folks here that it's possible to start a business. We're an example of what a cooperative business is. We show that it's possible for black and brown communities to create these things.
We're here at the Urban Tilth Farm in North Richmond. We're right across from where the Richmond oil refinery is, the Chevron oil refinery. And we are meeting Doria Robinson to talk to her about her work with the Cooperation Richmond movement.
Richmond is a city in the East Bay and San Francisco Bay Area on the eastern side of the bay, directly across from one of the wealthiest areas, I think, not only in California, but I think in the nation, of Marin County.
Doria is a third-generation Richmond resident and the executive director of the Urban Tilth Farm, a community-based organization rooted in Richmond and dedicated to cultivating a more sustainable, healthy, and just food system.
Some of the neighborhoods here are the poorest in the state. Actually, the neighborhood that we're right outside of, North Richmond, has one of the lowest income levels, the highest poverty.
We're here at the Urban Tilth Farm in North Richmond. We're right across from where the Richmond oil refinery is, the Chevron oil refinery. And we are meeting Doria Robinson to talk to her about her work with the Cooperation Richmond movement.
Richmond is a city in the East Bay and San Francisco Bay Area on the eastern side of the bay, directly across from one of the wealthiest areas, I think, not only in California, but I think in the nation, with Marin County.
Doria is a third-generation Richmond resident and the executive director of the Urban Tilth Farm, a community-based organization rooted in Richmond and dedicated to cultivating a more sustainable, healthy, and just food system.
Some of the neighborhoods here are the poorest in the state. Actually, the neighborhood that we're right outside of, North Richmond, has one of the lowest income levels, the highest poverty rate, the highest unemployment rate, the highest rate of violence, highest rates of, diabetes, heart disease, you name it. This community is really just burdened with it.
Richmond has been an industrial town from the start. In fact, the Chevron oil refinery was built there in 1902, 3 years before Richmond was even incorporated. During World War II, the city grew rapidly in population as workers came from all over the country to work in the shipyards that sprouted up around Richmond's deepwater port. Many of the residents of Richmond can trace their ancestry back to this point in time, when the population jumped from a sleepy 23,000 to well over 100,000, with a high proportion being African American, coming primarily from the rural areas of Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Today, Richmond's downtown has been largely abandoned, and its northern periphery is on the front lines of the Chevron Richmond refinery, processing over 240,000 barrels of crude oil every single day and creating a toxic environment for those living in the surrounding vicinity. According to a 2009 report by Communities for a Better Environment, in Richmond, the childhood asthma rate is more than twice the national average. It's an example of what we call a sacrifice zone, a community that has been largely incapacitated by environmental damage and economic neglect. Because of the many challenges that Richmond faces, Doria, along with others, founded Cooperation Richmond, a cooperative incubator set out to help build community wealth for low-income communities and communities of color in Richmond. Here's Gopal Dayaneni, a co-founder of Cooperation Richmond, who's been involved in movements for economic, environmental, and racial justice since the 1980s.
Cooperation Richmond is an organization that we have developed for the purpose of supporting worker-owned and community-owned cooperatives in Richmond, California, which is one of the poorest parts of the Bay Area, majority people of color community. And we provide coaching, connections, and capital is kind of the way we talk about it. We're not a co-op academy. Instead, we're interested in accompanying cooperatives to success. And we're focused on folks who are most excluded from the dominant economy, who we think should be the foundation of building the next economy.
And why cooperatives as the vehicle for helping folks who are excluded into the next economy? Where did that idea of the cooperative as the vehicle come from?
Well, there's a few different pieces of that. So the first is bosses just suck. You don't need them. Everybody's labor is valuable. All wealth is generated through the work of the living world. Making money off the movement of money is just extraction of wealth from other people. So the idea of people, all of us being able to voluntarily co-participate and control our own labor to meet our needs and the needs of our communities, and to share that wealth, to create commons of wealth and commons of resources, is what we think is a necessary element of the transition that we need to be in. The dominant economy extracts wealth from the living world, and it begins with extracting wealth from our own work. And so in order to both confront that, but also to build a new kind of muscle memory and how to be in the world, to actually practice self-governance on a daily basis, we need institutions, infrastructure that can do that.
Founded in October 2017, Cooperation Richmond is plugged into a broader national movement that includes similar initiatives throughout the country.
There's Cooperation Richmond, there's Cooperation Jackson, there's Cooperation Texas, which came before either of the two of those. It's a really good example of what we call translocal organizing. There is autonomous, place-based organizing with a unifying vision, shared strategies, and common frames. So we are all connected together, and so many other organizations who are supporting cooperative development are connected together because we share a common vision, because we're sharing strategies with each other, and because we're working together. And so in that way, we're all connected. And so we chose Cooperation Richmond because it sounds great, and it speaks to our larger relationship to a movement.
Cooperation Richmond played an important role in helping to get Rich City Rides off the ground.
Rich City Rides Bike and Skate Shop is this really powerful story. Before Rich City Rides, if you wanted to do any repairs to your bike, you had to go to Walmart, which is not exactly a bike repair place, or Target. That was it. And so people mostly just like threw their bike out if they got a flat, like literally threw their bike out. It's kind of painful to see. You know, oftentimes bikes are associated with gentrification and kind of an elitist thing you do on the weekends. In Richmond, it's really different. People can't afford cars, or their car is constantly breaking down, so they'll default to a bike just to get to work, or just to get to the store, or just to go get around. And so it actually is a need. You know, people actually needed to have a place to be able to fix their bike, which was much cheaper than trying to find another one.
Najari started Rich City Rides with Josue Hernandez, a first-generation immigrant who grew up in North Richmond, and Tay McGee, father of 5 with a history with the law. They first worked out of a storage space and other pop-up locations until someone offered them a storefront on the main street in Richmond, which was completely boarded up at the time and had been for years.
They were really running a pretty substantial business with nothing. And there's just no prospect for them to actually get to a point of profitability. They were not even close to profitability without having capital. Like, they needed more inventory. They needed a facelift, you know, like the shop didn't look like it, you know, looked like somebody's garage, you know, because that's they were just finding display cases off the street, you know, and bringing them in and sprucing them up, and you know. And so they came to us and they're like, you know, if we had capital, we could make this work. We have a vision. They had a business plan. They had a bunch of the right things wrong with it, you know. And so they were our first project.
In the last 2 years, Rich City Rides has grown into a successful business on McDonald Avenue and is one of the only locally owned businesses on the block. Not only has the store created meaningful work for 3 men who were up against a capitalist economic system that would have preferred to extract value from their labor or profit from their incarceration, but Rich City Rides has also become an important part of the Richmond community, putting together social bike rides and running a bunch of different programs, such as the Earn a Bike program that encourages youths to work on projects collaboratively and gives prizes out to members who bring their parents along on special family bike tours. They also offer free bike clinics once a week, where locals can come in and learn how to repair their bikes using the shop's tools.
So you use the crane tool? Fix It Fridays here at the bike shop. If you are attempting to do a repair and you're not quite sure how to do that, we'll lend you the tools. We'll talk you through it and show you how to do it. So we have this thing. It's called a bicycle recovery. Can I humor you with this tale? We have a bicycle recovery program.
Let me put the link to the phone. Anyway, you get the idea. Let's see.